The year is 2026. Nicolás Maduro is in a holding cell in Brooklyn. But before the history books dry the ink on this chapter, let's get one thing straight. It wasn't just a Delta Force operation that took him down. It wasn't just a political deal. The handcuffs you saw on the news in January 2026 were forged 10 years ago. They were forged by an economic catastrophe so complete, so mathematically impossible, that it turned the wealthiest nation in South America into a crime scene. Venezuela's story is about more than just the fall of a dictator. It is the story of how a regime that attempted to defy the laws of economic gravity dragged an entire nation off a cliff. It is the autopsy of a terrifying paradox, a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, yet forcing its people to scavenge through trash for a piece of bread. To understand how Venezuela became a failed state, we must return to the glittering days of Caracas, to that false paradise when oil was over $100 a barrel. The Hugo Chávez era was the golden age of populism. As oil revenues flowed, the government nationalized everything, subsidized everything, and promised the people a free life. But there was a problem. The system relied not on productivity, but solely on that black liquid coming out of the ground. When Chávez died in 2013 and was replaced by Maduro, a former bus driver, what he inherited was not a country, but a ticking time bomb. Maduro had only one strategy: to take Chávez's populist mistakes and multiply them tenfold with authoritarian repression and irrational economic decisions. There is a rule in economics: the more of something you print, the less valuable it becomes. Maduro thought this rule didn't apply to him. To finance government spending, he ordered the central bank to just print. The printing presses ran 24/7. The result? One of the most shameful scenes in economic history. The bolivar, Venezuela's currency, didn't just lose value. It practically evaporated. Inflation rates reached 1,000%, 10,000%, and finally 1,000,000%. Remember the days when you needed a sack full of cash just to buy a cup of coffee? People started weighing money instead of counting it. When the paper value of the money became cheaper than the ink printed on it, the public began weaving bags and wallets out of banknotes to sell to tourists. This wasn't a crisis of just numbers. It was the overnight disappearance of the middle class. When a professor's monthly salary dwindled to the price of a few eggs, the social contract collapsed. Instead of stopping this destruction, the Maduro regime imposed price controls. What happens when you command a shopkeeper to sell a product below cost? The shopkeeper stopped selling. Shelves went empty. Medicines ran out. People in hospitals began dying of simple infections or at the bedside of ventilators that failed due to power outages. Maduro, meanwhile, labeled all of this as an economic war by imperialist powers and handed control of food distribution networks to his complicit generals in exchange for their loyalty. Feeding the people was now measured by their loyalty to the regime. Now let's address the biggest question. How does a country with the largest oil reserves in the world go bankrupt? If you have more oil than Saudi Arabia, how do you end up waiting for days in gasoline lines? The answer lies in the lethal mix of corruption and incompetence. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, was once one of the most efficient energy companies in the world. However, Maduro fired the actual engineers and technocrats and replaced them with soldiers and cronies who were loyal but didn't know the O in oil. Unmaintained facilities began to rot, and pipelines began to leak. Production capacity plummeted from 3 million barrels a day to less than 700,000. Despite having oceans of oil underground, Venezuela became a joke for having to import gasoline from abroad because it couldn't run its own refineries. When oil revenues collapsed, the massive bribe pool Maduro used to feed his cronies dried up as well. At this point, the regime turned to darker paths to survive. When the money ran out, ideology was replaced by pure criminal logic. You've likely heard the term cartel of the suns, cartel de los soles. This isn't a street gang. This is a massive drug trafficking network run by the highest-ranking generals of the Venezuelan military. Those who wear suns as their rank on their shoulders. The structure around Maduro had ceased to be a government and had transformed into a transcontinental criminal cartel. The primary route for cocaine coming from Colombia now passed through Venezuela. It was no coincidence that the U.S. Department of Justice placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. He wasn't just a political oppressor, he was a criminal leader who opened all the state's resources, its planes, its ports, and its intelligence agency, to the global drug trade. While the people were starving, the regime's elites were enjoying themselves on luxury yachts on European shores. But this dark alliance brought very dangerous partners: Iranian drones, Russian mercenaries, and China's debt-trap diplomacy began using Caracas as a headquarters. Venezuela was no longer just a South American problem, it was a global security threat. The most tragic consequence of all this chaos is one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. There was a civil war in Syria. In Venezuela, there was only Maduro, and Maduro drove more people from their homes than the war did. More than 7 million Venezuelans hit the road, carrying only a backpack. Doctors, engineers, and teachers left their country to work as waiters or sell water on the streets in neighboring nations. This is the brain death of a country. Those who remained were either too old, too poor, or dependent on the regime's food parcels. But there was one thing Maduro didn't count on. Oppression and hunger could only control people for so long. By the mid-2020s, the military hierarchy he trusted so much began to shake. The generals lived in luxury, but the lower-level soldiers were as hungry as the people. When that deep crack within the armed forces merged with pressure from the outside world, the impenetrable wall around the regime began to tremble. And that was the moment the pin was pulled on the process leading to that cell in Brooklyn. While Maduro thought he was sitting in his palace, the strings of the drug and corruption web he had built were slowly tightening around his neck. The road to that January morning when it all ended was, in fact, the result of a terrifying experiment conducted in an economic laboratory. The result of a terrifying experiment conducted in an economic laboratory was nothing more than an inevitable bankruptcy. What brought the end of the Maduro regime was not just the hunger of the people, but the internal rot of the bloody alliance that kept the regime standing. By 2025, an internal war had broken out among the generals within the Cartel of the Suns over the shrinking pie. Oil production had reached a standstill, and American pressure on drug routes had reached its peak. For Maduro, loyalty had become a commodity too expensive to buy. Lower-ranking officers no longer wanted to protect the luxurious lives of their generals while their own families were starving. This was precisely when the foundations of the infamous Brooklyn operation were laid. Intelligence reports whispered that those closest to Maduro, those he called his indestructible shield, had begun secret talks with the CIA to save their own lives and their hidden offshore accounts. For a dictator, the greatest danger is when those holding the palace gates put the key to that gate on the bargaining table. By the time Maduro realized that the intelligence service he thought was loyal was actually reporting his every move to Washington, it was too late. On that misty morning in January, the airspace over Caracas was silently blacked out. But this time, the intervention did not resemble the noisy coups of the 20th century. It was a surgical operation. The doors of the Miraflores Palace were opened not by an external attack, but by an internal order. By the time Maduro was neutralized by his own guards, before he could find a chance to flee, the calendars marked January 15th. That thunderous voice that once said, "We stand tall against imperialism," was nothing but a whisper as he was boarded onto a plane under the supervision of a federal agent. The image that hit the news channels, a tired and broken man in handcuffs without his famous presidential sash, was not just the end of a political figure. That image was living proof of what populism, corruption, and economic ignorance can do to a nation. When you look at Venezuela today, what you see is not the wreckage of a war, but the destruction created by a way of governance. Hyperinflation may have stopped, Maduro may be gone, but the account of the stolen decade and the destroyed generations still stands. The autopsy of Venezuela taught us this. Even if you possess the world's richest resources, if you sacrifice justice, production, and meritocracy to drug cartels and ignorance, your end is to transform from a superpower into a crime scene. The sky Maduro sees when he looks out from his cell in Brooklyn is actually a landscape he drew with his own hands back in 2016 while taking his very first decisions. Economic rules are like the laws of physics. You can ignore them, but you can never escape their consequences. Venezuela has been etched into memory as one of history's most painful lessons. You don't need armies to destroy a country. It is enough to run the printing press uncontrollably and shroud the truth with lies. In the end, when the door of that Brooklyn cell slammed shut, an illusion ended, not just an era. The people of Venezuela now stand upon that massive wreckage, asking themselves one question: how do we say, never again? The answer to that question lies not in the courtrooms where Maduro is tried, but in the emptied streets of Venezuela, in the eyes of the 7 million people waiting to return home. As history writes the collapse of this narco state, it will not forget one thing. The handcuffs were not made of iron, but of broken mathematical equations.